One lingering question that's persisted for over 40 years. What really happened the night Natalie Wood died? The case was notorious, painful, and shadowed by doubt. And now, at 95, the words Robert Wagner has never managed to speak have finally come clear. His words stunned fans, rekindled old wounds, and thrust his story back into the news. In this video, we break down what he revealed, why it matters, and how it changes everything you thought you knew. The perfect night that wasn't. The evening of November 28, 1981 started off like a promise. Laughter, glasses, and warm light aboard the yacht. Radiant and fragile, Natalie Wood moved through the rooms with practiced charm and a private fear of water. Robert Wagner hosted with the soft manners of a man used to public eyes and private storms. Then there was Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star from her new film, hovering in close proximity and adding a thin layer of tension. Friends joined them for Thanksgiving weekend, meant to be a gentle escape to Catalina Island's hush. They joked about roles, aging in Hollywood, and the brittle privacy that fame had forced upon them all. And no one could know how the night would change, how easy smiles would harden into something sharper. A sense of ordinary celebration clung to the yacht's wood and brass like a last false comfort. Under that comfort were old resentments, jealousies, and small cruelties folded into decades of marriage. At midnight, the glow of the party would meet the deep dark of open water and a terrible absence. The people and the boat. The Splendor sat anchored off Catalina, a floating private room for a band of actors and friends. Natalie, Robert, Christopher Walken, Captain Dennis Davern, and a few close companions filled its cramped spaces. They drank wine, told stories, and replayed scenes that once made them famous and untouchable. Captain Davern kept a watchful, practical eye, while the guests drifted between laughter and sharper words. A pleasant day at sea slowly turned inward as tensions around Natalie's career and marriage surfaced. Wagner's old possessive patterns reappeared in small jealous remarks and a hardening around the eyes. The even, steady presence of Walken was enough to make Wagner glance up and tighten his jaw. The most dangerous things on board were not the waves, but the old fractures people carried inside. What the yacht held that night was memories, secrets, and brittle roles each pretended not to see. The boat was a theater, inside which old acts played out again with the dangerous spontaneity of the unscripted. The argument and the bottle. A fight began, as it often does, with a few sharp sentences and then a bottle thrown into the air. Wagner and Natalie argued about work, loyalty, and the closeness she displayed with her co-star, Christopher. Words had turned into volume. A wine bottle had smashed upon the table, glass everywhere, like a sudden small war. Davern later recalled yelling, voices booming inside the yacht's cabin, the sound loud enough to echo. Party's easy veneer started to crack. Jagged edges revealing jealousies and fears and years of private hurt. Natalie, vulnerable and terrified of water, donned a thin gown that draped her fragile, exposed body. Witnesses would later disagree about many of the details, but the violent outburst had occurred. Anger can be a quick flame. On that narrow yacht, it grew in tight circles and fierce breath. After the clash of glass, some tried to steady the mood, while others stood silent and raw. That broken bottle was a small physical mark of a far deeper break in the foundation of a marriage. The vanishing. Sometime after the argument, Natalie slipped away into the night without fanfare from the cabin. Her feathered robe and nightdress left a trail of bewilderment and immediate, dangerous questions in their wake. No one could place her feet on the deck at the time she left. No one saw her step into the dark. The dinghy had been left untied, and it was later recovered adrift with the key still in position. Davern said he heard Wagner say, "Don't turn that on," after someone suggested turning on the searchlights. For hours on end, the yacht's lights remained low, and an eerie weight supplanted urgent action aboard the vessel. Nearby boats heard faint noises and cries that would later become contested, haunting testimony. By morning, Natalie's absence had turned from mystery into terrifying reality. Her body lay in the water. The night that had started off so full of song ended in a cold, final silence and a drowned small body. At daybreak, the ocean returned its secret and left Splendor's guests with one impossible question. Why? The first discovery and the autopsy. When they found her, Natalie floated face down in a stretch of cold Pacific a mile from the yacht. Her nightgown clung to her like a ghostly shroud, a detail that later fed disbelief and unease. The autopsy report, presented by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, showed bruising on arms, knees, and wrists, and scratches on the neck and face. Toxicology showed alcohol, seasickness medication, and painkillers in her system, a dangerous cocktail for balance. Bruises raised urgent questions as to whether they were from a fall, a botched climb, or a violent struggle beforehand. Noguchi's private notes hinted at injuries inconsistent with a simple misstep. Public report remained terse. Public reaction quickly polarized between those who called it a tragic accident and those who smelled foul play. For a country accustomed to star-shaped narratives, a messy, ambiguous death made many people uneasy and suspicious. The findings of the coroner became the fuel for decades of rumor, investigation, and a family's unending demand for truth. At that early moment, the body and the medical notes marked the case with a medical mystery and moral weight. The missing hours. An ugly, conspicuous gap opened between when Natalie was last seen and when she was reported missing. She was last seen around 11 p.m., and the authorities were not called until about 3:30 a.m. Those 4 hours would later form the hardest, angriest center of public suspicion and formal scrutiny. Davern would later testify that Wagner had discouraged searchlights, delayed calls, and urged silence on board. The harbor master had to press Wagner to call the Coast Guard, a delay that made official investigators uneasy. Quieter men on nearby boats reported screams and cries. Those voices either reached ears or dissolved into fog. People wondered why, in a moment of possible emergency, the yacht's crew would linger and not act fast. And the fact that no alarm had been immediately raised led to everyone's greatest fear. Was there time to save her that night? The timeline was filled with silences, changing stories, and uncomfortable stretches of plausible denial, investigators found. Those missing hours became a long, dark corridor that investigators would walk and re-examine for the rest of their lives. Davern's confession years later. For decades, Captain Dennis Davern kept a tight, modified story of the night till the 2011 revelations that shocked investigators. He confessed that he had lied by omission earlier, shifting details to paint a cleaner picture than what actually happened. Davern's new account now included hearing a sound like someone being shoved into water and Wagner saying, "Leave her there." That confession reopened wounds and forced the Los Angeles Police Department to re-evaluate what had been considered final. Davern's belated honesty complicated public faith in the original investigation and blurred lines between fear and loyalty. Was he shielding Wagner then out of fear, friendship, or a desire to avoid scandal in Hollywood's glare? It was the captain's about-face that gave the case an ugly new energy and brought about a change in how the coroner labeled the death. The quiet case became noisy as formerly hidden testimonies and new witness statements started surfacing with accusations and doubts. Davern's last truth did not solve the mystery. It further entangled the story and broke many people's earlier certainties. And indeed, the whole voyage of truth was forced to circle back when one of those who steered the boat changed his testimony. Voices from boats nearby. Independent witnesses on other yachts would later become vital, their memories hurt by time and fear. Marilyn Wayne and John Payne, who said they heard a cry for help by a woman for nearly 15 minutes that night. Wayne said she then turned on her light and heard a man respond in a calm, lethargic tone, saying, "Okay, honey, we'll get you." After that exchange, no engine started, no rescue followed. The sea returned to the sound of silence. Years later, Wayne claimed she was threatened after coming forward, a note meant to silence that small truth. Another witness, who was a young fisherman, would later say he heard desperate cries pierced by the fog and dark. Voices scattered, imperfect, turned to shards, showing sometimes conscience, sometimes sparking conspiracy. Their testimony invited the horrifying possibility that help was nearby, aware, and yet blocked or disinterested. If the cries were real, then the night held more than an accident. It contained a human call for life, which went unanswered. Those outer voices became moral mirrors, reflecting a night when a single act of rescue might have changed everything. The first official conclusion and public reaction. By 2003, the case had been closed, with a conclusion of accidental drowning, and many accepted the finding. To the families and critics, the official label felt incomplete, as if a hard edge of truth had been shaved away. Gossip and headlines dominated for decades. The public couldn't decide if it wanted closure or another scandal. Wagner, grieving publicly, remained a paradox, a sorrowful widower and yet a figure the public distrusted. Some spoke of a tragic sequence of mistakes. Others insisted on a dark, quiet calculation no one wanted to acknowledge. In Hollywood, where image and narrative often eclipse messy facts, the case became a sensational, cautionary tale. Fans mourned the bright star, snuffed too early. That was Natalie. Families mourned deeper, more complicated losses. The official conclusion did not end the debate, but instead seeded generations of books, documentaries, and fiercely argued articles. The police's shifting resources met the public's appetite for answers, against the stubborn emptiness of conclusive evidence. So the story rested in a tense, uncomfortable middle, a death declared accidental by law, questioned by conscience. A family's anger and a sister's cry for justice. Lana Wood, Natalie's younger sister, would not let silence stand in for truth. She spent decades demanding answers. Lana's public statements were blunt and painful. She believed Robert Wagner knew more than he admitted. Persistence kept the story alive, never allowing time to wear down the rough edges of suspicion and memory. For Lana, every unanswered question became an accusation that opened old grief into new public outrage. She insisted the daytime image of a graceful star hid a woman who had lived a real, paralyzing fear of water. A sister's pain is an intimate and relentless one. Lana harnessed that private grief into a very public quest for justice. Her calls to reopen the case embarrassed Hollywood and drew in investigators anxious to retest old evidence. Family testimony, defiant and teary-eyed, shifted public perception of Wagner and changed the course of legal momentum. Lana's voice became a moral anchor for those who would not accept neat answers from a messy, ambiguous night. Her fight ensured the case would not be a closed headline, but remained a living question. The long, shifting investigation. The police reopened and closed the case several times over the decades, with each revisit shifting public belief. Old reports were dug up, witnesses re-interviewed, and new forensic perspectives applied to the same cold facts. Eventually, the Los Angeles County coroner changed Natalie's death certificate to reflect drowning and other undetermined factors. That amended cause of death in 2012 gave investigators room to revisit details previously dismissed as settled. Detectives labeled Wagner a person of interest in 2018, an official designation that would ripple through headlines. A change in police views did not equate to guilt proven. They did, however, show that certainty had never been theirs. The evidence remained circumstantial. What prosecutors needed was physical proof or a credible, consistent confession. Time altered memories, blurred sounds heard in a fog, and complicated where credibility should be placed in testimony. investigators relied on minor discrepancies, changed timelines, and the uncomfortable human desire to attribute blame. Every reopening made the story newer again, every new claim adding salt to already raw family wounds. Witnesses and new testimonies. Over the years, new witnesses cropped up, one with fresh details, sometimes to clarify, sometimes to further muddy the events. A former colleague described witnessing Natalie being handled roughly by Wagner on several occasions in the 1960s. One 17-year-old fisherman later testified that he had heard cries for help on the night Natalie died. These additions prompted headlines and forced investigators to reconsider theories they had previously discarded. But human memory is a tricky, unreliable witness. Time can distort how people think they remember an event. Some of the witnesses even contradicted others on essential details, including the exact time, tones of voices, and directions. These accounts, despite their contradictions, served to feed the media and build up public belief in foul play. Prosecutors considered whether these testimonies would withstand cross-examination and be reliable in court. Public opinion was quicker to decide than any trial could keep up with, usually condemning well before the legal proof was there. New witness accounts kept the hunt alive while also complicating plain, painful facts that mattered most. The role of the media and books. The case was framed in books and documentaries and endless magazine pages, not as one mystery, but as many competing myths. Authors like Marty Raley stoked interest with renewed allegations and passionate calls for legal action. Every tape, every interview, and every court document was dissected by media productions until it became part of pop history. The public learned to sort through sensational headlines, often confusing rumor with newly discovered fact. Hollywood's appetite for scandal kept the story alive, turning it into some sort of modern tragic myth. For those reading and watching, the drama offered a guilty pleasure, an unsolved puzzle involving famous lives. But media frenzy also served to simplify, caricature, and sometimes vilify people who never face trial. Books can illuminate and mislead at once, laying persuasive narrative over equivocal evidence and opinion. The result was a culture that fed on suspicion while offering no legal resolution to those desiring it. Media, thus, became simultaneously investigator and jury in a case where the courts never really judged. The public's verdict and the family's fractures. Public opinion was divided into camps, some who believed that Wagner was guilty of the crime and others who clung to tragedy as an accident. Natalie's daughter, Natasha, sprang to Wagner's defense, pressing for a more multi-dimensional and human picture of her father. This division tore families and fans, making private grief into a public performance and private testimony into a spectacle. To some, Wagner's silence was guilt. To others, it was a man broken by loss and unable to explain. The scandal revealed how the feelings of grief, suspicion, and loyalty can be stacked within one human heart at once. Long after the headlines cooled, survivors carried the heavy weight of ambiguous guilt that never cleared. Rooms that once housed secrets now had rifts in them, and those divisions hardened into lasting mistrust. At times, the cruelty of the public was like a secondary wound to those already afflicted with loss. Yet the debate persisted because unresolved pain invites explanations, however partial and unreliable these are. So the case remained alive in the public mind, less as a legal file and more as a cultural wound. Evidence that raised eyebrows. Several small facts continued to bother investigators and skeptics because they resisted the neat accident narrative. Natalie had a serious fear of water, and the idea of her willingly boarding a dinghy at night was implausible to many. The dinghy was found adrift, with the key in place and oars still secured, contradicting claims of someone rowing away. Bruises on Natalie's arms and body indicated something more than a mere slip to some forensic readers. Wagner's inconsistencies over the decades created a pattern to many that seemed like evasions or a poor memory. The 4-hour delay before reporting her missing remained the single clearest and most damaging inconsistency. Any one of these details could be explained in isolation, but together they composed a troubling mosaic. For critics, it was the accumulation of odd facts that meant reason to suspect intentional wrongdoing rather than a tragic fall. For defenders, the same details showed only that grief and time muddy memory and distort perception. This evidence left truth hovering between reasonable doubt and aching suspicion without the resolution of either. Legal hurdles and the limits of proof. Despite suspicion, prosecutors faced steep legal barriers, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and little direct evidence. No confession, no murder weapon, and no credible eyewitness saw the fatal act committed by anyone. Persons of interest can be named, but without evidence to convict, legal systems must rely on standard burdens. Time erodes physical evidence, and the ocean consumes and conceals what, at one time, might have supplied obvious answers. Memories of witnesses change, documents are lost, and chances to test new forensic evidence disappear. The self-restraint of the legal system that frustrated the public also protected against the risk of convicting without proof. Where justice systems fail to provide definitive answers, communities fill the vacuum with rumor and anger. Investigators continue to weigh what's prosecutable against what's morally suspected in the court of public opinion. Ultimately, the case demonstrated how the law limits the reach of moral certainty when evidence cannot keep pace. The law demanded proof that decades of investigation and suspicion could not decisively supply. Wagner's later years and public statements. As Robert Wagner aged under the long shadow of the night, there came more reflective public remarks with age. He admitted sorrow and regret, adding that he frequently wondered whether he could have acted differently that night. Those words were read two ways: soft confession by some, simple grief by others who wouldn't condemn him. Wagner's memoirs and interviews offered glimpses of a man who loved and who had lost without explanation. He denied any wrongdoing, yet gave an account of how his life had been molded by doubt and unhealed wounds. Public sympathy and suspicion coexisted uneasily, built upon personal loyalty, celebrity myth, and raw grief. In his later years, he was at times portrayed as a man softened by decades of loss and media attack. Words of regret did nothing to resolve the legal and moral issues involved. If anything, they further muddled public opinion. In the end, Wagner's longevity made him a living reminder of a death that never left those who remembered it. His final years had no neat resolution, but rather a slow decline of a man still carrying a catastrophic memory. The case in cultural memory. Natalie Wood's death moved out of legal files and into cultural myth, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangerous edges of fame. Her life and death became a symbol of how Hollywood blends glamour with hidden pain and private fear. This is a tale that attracted a generation that loves true crime and unsolved mysteries for their unresolved moral puzzles. Documentaries and podcasts turn the tragedy into narrative entertainment, frequently blurring the boundary between reporting and drama. The case asked larger questions about celebrity, privacy, and how public curiosity shapes the pursuit of truth. Audiences wonder not just who did what, but how fame might protect or destroy the people who embody it. As this wears on, it becomes a kind of parable about the cost of exposure, the loneliness of fame. Natalie's image, beautiful, haunted, talented, remains vivid, her death a lesson taught by rumor. The cultural appetite for such dark stories ensures the mystery will continue to be retold and reinterpreted. In that larger memory, the facts function almost like a substrate for moral reflection, rather than neat historical closure. Questions left unanswered. And after more than 4 decades, it still keeps it tight, maddening questions alive and unanswered. Why would Natalie leave the cabin alone that night if she was afraid of water and usually avoided boats at night? Did the people on the Splendor act in cowardice or careless delay, or with a complexity that defies simple labels? Who was the voice speaking so calmly to cries for help? And why did that voice not produce a rescue? Was it possible that a single act of courage on that foggy night might have saved a life and kept a family together? Why did it take so long for critical witnesses to feel safe enough to tell what they knew without fear? Was the failure of an immediate action the result of several small human errors or an intentional attempt to cover something up? Do apologies and late sorrow stand equal to legal truth? Or are they only human attempts at moral repair? Each question that's left unanswered opens another. It's those gaps that keep rumors alive and official answers fragile. The case remained a mosaic of accusations, tender memories, and the stubborn silence of an ocean that remembers little. And so the story keeps going on to ask what each listener will decide to believe about that cold night at sea. The lasting human cost. Beyond headlines, accusations, and memoirs, the deepest harm is not to reputation, but to human hearts left raw. Natalie's family carries grief that a verdict cannot fix, and public suspicion cannot soothe in any lasting way. Wagner lived for decades under public judgment, haunted by what he could not explain and what he could not repair. Friends and children passed through the scandal's wake, their memories colored by rumor and media appetite. The case changed how lovers, parents, and fans remembered Natalie, not just as a star, but as a person who was taken away too soon. With every telling, the wound reopens because grief doesn't expire after some years or when new investigations end. Maybe the most honest conclusion is an admission of loss without absolute knowledge, a quiet human limit. We can recite the facts, enumerate the witnesses, and inspect bruises, but we cannot fully reconstruct that night's spirit. What remains is a mournful, unresolved tale of love and danger, a story that wants both justice and peace. In the end, Natalie's memory asks us to hold loss with care, to pursue answers with rigor, and to remember the human cost. The story of Natalie Wood's final night remains in that place where truth and doubt share the same space. We know the facts, the timeline, the witnesses, and the changing statements. Yet we're left with a silence that no report or interview has been able to break. It's a silence shaped by fear, love, regret, and the strange pressure that fame places on private lives. Natalie's death serves as a painful reminder of just how fragile people can be behind bright images and public praise. One night altered the circle of every life that came in contact with it, leaving scars that time cannot mask or smooth. Those who loved her still search for clarity, and those who study the case still hope for a final answer. Feel free to share your thoughts on this story and let us know what you believe, and be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive.